The morning of May 5, 1945, was unusually still in the small Dutch town of Wageningen. A thin silver mist clung to the rooftops, as if the air itself was holding its breath. The war had stretched on for 6 long years, and the town wore that weight like a shroud. Burnt timbers, shattered windows, gardens turned into barren patches of dirt, and silence, an unfamiliar, unsettling silence that made every sound from the approaching American convoy echo like a drumbeat in a tomb. Staff Sergeant William Cooper, 101st Airborne Division, shifted slightly in his seat as the jeep bounced along the cracked road. He'd been through liberation towns before: Paris, Brussels, Luxembourg. He remembered waving crowds, flowers thrown into the air, girls climbing onto tanks to kiss soldiers who represented hope itself. He'd come to associate victory with sound, cheering, laughter, music, church bells ringing for the first time in years. But this morning, as the American vehicles rolled through the outskirts of Wageningen, Cooper didn't hear any bells, no voices, not even the bark of a stray dog. Just the steady, rhythmic growl of engines and the soft crunch of tires rolling over gravel. He lifted his goggles slightly and squinted at the row of houses ahead. Wooden shutters hung crooked on their hinges. Curtains, once bright, were now faded and stiff. No smoke rose from the chimneys, though the air still carried the bitter chill of spring mornings in the Netherlands. It felt less like they were entering a liberated town, and more like they were crossing into a graveyard that had simply forgotten to bury its dead. Then the doors began to open, not all at once, slowly, uncertainly. One door, then another, then another. Figures emerged like shadows pulling themselves out of the fog. Cooper expected shouts, hands waving, maybe children running toward the jeeps. But no one ran. No one waved. They shuffled. The men walked with the posture of people decades older than their actual years. Their faces were sunken, their eyes dull. Women leaned on each other for support, wrapped in coats too thin for the cold. And the children. The children were what froze Cooper in his seat. They looked like tiny skeletons in wooden clogs. Their clothes hung loosely from their frames as if they'd been made for someone else long ago. Most of them didn't speak. Some didn't even look up. They just stood by the roadside and watched the convoy, their eyes too large for their narrow faces, their skin the color of wax. "Jesus Christ," murmured Private Miller beside Cooper. He wasn't the kind of man who got quiet easily, but now his voice was barely a whisper. "They look like ghosts." Cooper didn't answer. He didn't have to. The sight said everything. The convoy slowed to a crawl as they reached the center of town. From where he sat, Cooper could hear the faint creaking of the jeep as it rolled over uneven stones. He saw more people stepping outside, some gripping door frames as if walking even a few steps would drain the last of their strength. This wasn't the energy of a town welcoming its liberators. This was the movement of people too weak to celebrate. He felt a dull ache in his chest, not the sharp, immediate kind of fear he knew from battle, but something deeper, a heaviness. This wasn't what they'd been trained for. No briefing, no map, no radio order had prepared him for the sight of a population that looked like it had simply been starved out of existence. The jeep stopped near a narrow stretch of road bordered by a shallow ditch. Cooper lifted his rifle slightly out of habit, then lowered it again. There was no danger here, only exhaustion. And that's when he saw her. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing alone near the edge of the road. She was wearing a faded blue dress that hung awkwardly off her shoulders, the seams restitched over and over again. It was too big for her. No, not too big, Cooper realized. She was too small for it. Her body had shrunk. Her legs were thin, almost stick-like, disappearing into a pair of wooden clogs that clattered softly when she shifted her weight. Her hair was pale and brittle. Her cheeks were hollow, her collarbones sharp as blades beneath the fabric. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She just stared at them with a kind of quiet, cautious desperation. Cooper leaned forward, elbows on his knees. He'd seen starving people before, refugees, prisoners. But there was something different about a starving child. It cut straight through the armor that war had built around his heart. He could feel it cracking. The girl swayed a little, as if even standing upright was too much effort. One of the soldiers on the next jeep tried to wave at her. She didn't wave back. Her hands remained clenched against her chest, as though she was holding onto something invisible. Cooper glanced at Miller. Miller looked back at him, wide-eyed. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They both understood the same thing. This town hadn't just been occupied. It had been starved. Behind the girl, more children began to appear. First 2, then 5, then a whole line of them, emerging quietly from alleyways and doorways. Their faces were the same, drawn, thin, cautious. Not one of them smiled. The Jeep engine idled softly. The rumble filled the silence like a drumbeat in a funeral procession. Cooper swallowed hard. He'd fought across Europe for almost a year. He'd watched friends die, seen towns burn, and held his rifle through nights that never seemed to end. But nothing in all those months, not the gunfire, not the screaming, not the smell of blood and cordite, hit him the way those hollow eyes did. These weren't enemy soldiers. They weren't even civilians caught in the crossfire. They were children. Starving children. And right then, William Cooper realized something he'd never truly felt before. This war wasn't just about guns and borders. It was about moments like this, moments when a single decision could mean the difference between a child living or dying. The convoy commander's voice crackled through the radio, but Cooper barely heard it. His attention was locked on the girl in the blue dress. She was still standing there, still swaying, still looking at them like she didn't quite believe they were real. Cooper reached for the strap of his pack. His fingers brushed against the hard, familiar shape of a ration chocolate bar inside. Standard issue. Dry. Bitter. Soldiers complained about them all the time. But to that little girl, it would be a miracle. And for the first time in weeks, Cooper's hands began to shake. The engine of the Jeep hummed softly beneath William Cooper's boots, but he barely noticed it anymore. The war around him seemed to recede. Gunfire, strategy, orders. All of it faded into a quiet, fragile space between him and the little girl in the faded blue dress. She didn't move when he stepped down from the Jeep. The moment his boots touched the road, a few adults along the street flinched instinctively. Months of occupation had taught them to fear uniforms. To them, soldiers meant control, hunger, and cruelty. But this time the uniforms were different. American, not German. They didn't seem to know how to believe that yet. Cooper took one careful step forward. The little girl swayed again but didn't retreat. She stared at him the way someone lost at sea might look at a distant light, afraid to hope too soon. His hand reached for the strap of his field pack. He'd done this motion 100 times, usually to check ammo, to pull out a map, to find cigarettes. But this time, he wasn't thinking like a soldier. He was thinking like a man looking at a child who had known nothing but war and hunger. His fingers brushed against the hard, rectangular shape of a ration chocolate bar. It wasn't much. In fact, most soldiers hated the thing. It was dense, bitter, and tasted faintly like chalk. But it was high in calories, made to keep men alive in the field. He'd eaten half of it the night before, sitting by a cold fire with Miller. The other half was still wrapped, sitting quietly at the bottom of his pack. He pulled it out slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. The paper wrapper crinkled softly in the silence. The little girl's eyes followed the sound. Behind her, a few children craned their necks, thin as reeds, watching what he held in his hand. None of them spoke. Their faces were pale, their lips cracked, their hair brittle from months of malnutrition. Cooper didn't know their names, but he could read their hunger as clearly as any language. He knelt down to lower himself to her level. His knees scraped the cold, uneven stones of the street. She was close enough now that he could see every sharp angle of her face, the hollows beneath her eyes, the way her chest rose and fell with shallow, fragile breaths. She was 7, maybe 8, but she carried herself like someone who had lived through decades. He extended the chocolate toward her. For a heartbeat, she didn't move at all. The look on her face wasn't one of immediate joy. It was suspicion, confusion, the kind of cautious hesitation that only comes from being hurt too many times. Then, so fast he almost didn't see it, her hand darted out. Small, bone-thin. She grabbed the chocolate like someone catching a rope at the edge of a cliff. She didn't eat it right away. She pressed it against her chest, clutching it with both hands as though afraid it might be taken away. Her lips trembled. Tears filled her hollow eyes and slipped silently down her cheeks. When she finally looked up at him, her mouth moved before any sound came out. "Thank you," she whispered in broken English. It was barely more than breath. "Thank you. Thank you." Cooper's throat tightened. He'd heard plenty of people say thank you in the war. Town officials, politicians, soldiers who owed their lives to someone else. But this was different. This wasn't gratitude for a grand act of heroism. This was gratitude for a piece of chocolate, for calories that meant her body might survive one more day. And then something unexpected happened. From the alleys and doorways, more children began to appear. First a handful, then a dozen, then what felt like dozens more, their small faces emerging from the mist. Some held hands, some came alone. All of them were silent. Their steps were soft, unsteady, and they were all staring at the thing the little girl was holding to her chest. "Jesus," Miller muttered from the jeep. His voice cracked halfway through the word. Cooper looked back over his shoulder. The rest of the squad had noticed too. They were young men, most barely in their 20s, who had seen enough horror to last a lifetime. They'd killed, they'd lost friends, they'd marched through blood and mud. But none of that had prepared them for a line of starving children watching them like their lives depended on it. Cooper stood up slowly, forcing air into lungs that felt suddenly too small. He glanced at the men in his jeep. Nobody needed orders. They understood. "Break out everything we've got," he said quietly. For a second they hesitated. Not out of unwillingness, but out of something heavier. Every ration they had was meant to keep them alive, to sustain them on the move. But as they looked at those children, at the hollow eyes, the shaking hands, the hope blooming timidly where there had been none before, it wasn't even a question. Miller reached into his pack first, pulling out his last 2 chocolate bars. O'Reilly followed, tossing a can of Spam onto the hood. Someone else pulled out hardtack, biscuits, crackers. In minutes, the Jeep hood became a small mountain of food, rations that had seemed so ordinary just hours ago, but now felt like gold. When Cooper handed the little girl another small piece of chocolate, she held it out to the boy beside her, sharing it with him without hesitation. He bit into it slowly, like he was afraid it might disappear if he moved too fast. Tears streaked down his dirt-covered cheeks. The line of children began to move closer. Not rushing, not screaming, just drifting forward with a quiet reverence, as if they were approaching something sacred. Adults followed behind at a distance, their expressions dazed and disbelieving. For months, they'd lived in a world where soldiers took food. They didn't know how to process soldiers giving it away. Cooper and his men began handing out rations, crackers, chocolate, cans of meat, whatever they had. Their fingers brushed against cold, trembling hands. The children didn't say much. Most were too weak, but the way they held those small treasures said more than words ever could. Some clutched their food to their chest, unwilling to let go. Others broke small pieces off and shared them with siblings. A few simply sat down where they stood, eating in silence with wide, stunned eyes. And all around them, the air began to change. For months, the town had been a graveyard. Now something flickered through the crowd. Not noise, not celebration, but life. A pulse of it. The way a single flame can bring warmth back to a cold room. Cooper glanced at the girl again. She was still there, still holding what was left of her chocolate. But now there was something new in her expression. It wasn't joy, not yet. It was something quieter, more fragile. Hope. He exhaled slowly. It felt like the first real breath he'd taken in weeks. All around him, soldiers and children moved in a slow, delicate dance. One side giving, the other side receiving, both realizing in their own way that this moment was more powerful than any battle they'd fought. And in that misty Dutch morning, William Cooper understood something simple and devastating. War can take everything away, but sometimes a single piece of chocolate can give it back. The convoy had barely stopped for 15 minutes, but Wageningen no longer felt like the same place it had been when the Americans arrived. When the first chocolate bar changed hands, something unseen but unmistakable passed through the crowd. It wasn't noise, no cheering, no singing. It was softer than that. It was breath. It was the sound of people remembering they were still alive. Cooper's boots scraped the cobblestones as he moved from child to child, handing out pieces of ration chocolate, crackers, and canned meat. Around him, his squad followed without needing to be told. The hood of the Jeep was now almost bare. Soldiers emptied their packs like men who suddenly understood the value of everything they carried. Miller crouched down to help a little boy open a can of Spam. The child stared at the pink meat like he was looking at something impossible, then took the smallest, most careful bite Cooper had ever seen in his life. The boy closed his eyes as he chewed, and his whole body shuddered. Not from fear, but from the shock of flavor, of nourishment after months of nothing. Behind the children, adults began to step closer, slowly, hesitantly. It was clear they didn't know what to do. For months, soldiers had taken their food, their homes, their lives. They'd seen men in uniforms kick down doors, confiscate bread, punish anyone caught hoarding. Now they were watching foreign soldiers kneeling down in the mud, giving chocolate to children as if they were family. A woman in her 30s, though hunger made her look closer to 50, clutched a thin shawl around her shoulders. She approached a few steps, then froze when Cooper looked up. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Then her hand went to her mouth as her shoulders began to shake. She wasn't crying from fear. She was crying because this was the first kindness she'd seen in months. Another man, older, with a gaunt face and sunken cheeks, slowly took off his cap and held it to his chest. His eyes locked on the jeep, on the pile of rations that was already almost gone. He didn't move forward. He just stood there with a strange reverence, as though looking at a miracle that might vanish if he got too close. The children didn't hesitate like the adults. Their survival instincts overpowered everything else. A few of them dropped to the ground where they stood and ate silently, their small fingers clutching crackers and chocolate like it was treasure. Others clutched their food and ran back to doorways, disappearing into the dark of their homes, probably to share with siblings who were too weak to walk. "Coop," Miller called quietly. Cooper turned. Miller's face was flushed, and his hands were shaking slightly as he passed a tin of biscuits to a little girl no older than 5. The soldier was a loudmouth back home, the kind who bragged about bars, girls, and baseball. But right now, there was no trace of the swagger. Just quiet, almost frightened tenderness. Look at them," Miller muttered. "Jesus." "I know," Cooper said softly. They didn't talk more than that. Words felt clumsy and too small for what they were seeing. A few meters away, Private O'Reilly pulled his extra jacket off his shoulders and wrapped it around a boy who was shivering even though the sun was out. The boy didn't say anything. He just let himself be wrapped up, clutching the fabric like it was warmth itself. Another soldier cracked open his last can of condensed milk and began pouring small amounts into dented tin cups that parents had brought out. A woman took one of the cups, her hands trembling so hard some of the milk spilled onto the stones. She didn't even drink it herself. She crouched immediately and held it to the lips of a baby wrapped in a blanket. The child drank greedily. The woman's eyes flooded with tears. For weeks, perhaps months, these people had been watching their children starve. No rescue had come, no miracle, just the long, slow suffocation of hunger. And now, suddenly, without warning, salvation had rolled in on American tires. The more Cooper looked around, the more he saw a kind of quiet chaos unfolding. Parents wept openly. Some knelt on the ground as if praying. Others touched the soldiers' sleeves, hesitant, unsure if it was even allowed. The soldiers didn't push them away. They offered food, jackets, smiles that were shaky but real. One old man reached out and grabbed Cooper's hand. His grip was weak but deliberate. His eyes glistened with tears as he whispered something in Dutch. Cooper didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. He nodded back, the soldier's throat burning from the weight of the moment. The air itself began to shift. For months, Wageningen had been a place where hope had dried up like a riverbed in winter. But in that single hour, with a few rations and a handful of soldiers, it felt like the river was beginning to flow again. From somewhere down the street, a church bell rang. Just once. The sound was uneven, rusty, like it hadn't been used in years. People looked up instinctively, startled by the sound. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a ceremony. Someone had simply gone inside the old church and pulled the rope. One note, then another, then another. The bell wasn't loud, but it was enough. Someone laughed, a small, uncertain laugh from a child clutching a chocolate bar. It wasn't the kind of laughter that fills a parade. It was soft, fragile, but it was real. The first laugh the town had probably heard in months, and as if that laugh cracked something open, other sounds followed. Voices whispering, then rising, footsteps moving closer, parents lifting their children in their arms. The silence that had wrapped the town like a shroud began to unravel thread by thread. Cooper leaned against the side of the jeep for a moment, taking it all in. His hands were empty now. He'd given away everything in his pack. He didn't care. Around him, his men were doing the same. These weren't orders. This was instinct. Miller came to stand beside him. "You ever think," he said, his voice low, "that maybe this right here is what winning looks like?" Cooper didn't answer right away. He looked at the girl in the blue dress, who was now sitting on the curb with another child, both nibbling on crumbs of chocolate like it was a feast. Their faces were still pale, still thin, but their eyes were alive in a way they hadn't been before. "Yeah," Cooper finally said, "I think maybe it is." The convoy commander was on the radio nearby, barking logistical updates to headquarters, but the soldiers on the ground didn't seem to hear. Their war, for this one quiet hour, wasn't being fought with rifles or maps. It was being fought with chocolate, crackers, warm jackets, and trembling hands. And they were winning. By the time the sun began to push through the mist, Wageningen no longer looked like the place the Americans had entered that morning. The same buildings stood there, crooked and cracked from years of occupation. The same streets, the same broken windows, the same air heavy with the scent of damp wood and ash. But everything felt different. The stillness had changed. The fear had loosened its grip. And in its place, something quiet and warm had begun to spread, like embers slowly waking in the ashes of a long-dead fire. The little girl in the blue dress sat on the curb, chocolate smeared faintly at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes weren't bright yet. Hunger doesn't vanish in an hour, but they no longer held only emptiness. She held the last piece of chocolate in both hands as if it were a secret. Beside her, a boy in a threadbare sweater leaned his head against her shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They didn't have to. They had food in their stomachs for the first time in weeks. Around them, families moved slowly through the square like people waking from a nightmare. Some carried rations back to their homes. Others simply sat down on the ground, too weak to celebrate but unwilling to let this moment pass without feeling it. A few church bells rang again, uneven, off-rhythm, rusty from disuse. But their imperfection made the sound even more real. Cooper wiped his hands on his trousers. They were sticky with chocolate, canned meat, and mud. It was a strange, almost childlike mess. A few feet away, Miller was pouring the last of his water into a tin cup for a toddler. O'Reilly had turned his jacket inside out and tied it around a shivering boy like a makeshift blanket. Other soldiers were doing the same, offering whatever they had left: water, food, gloves, a hand on a shoulder. None of it had been ordered. No one had to tell them what to do. For once, the war had no rank structure. Just people. A Dutchman approached Cooper then. His face was gaunt, the skin stretched thin across sharp cheekbones. But his posture was straight, the way a man stands when dignity is all he has left. He wore an old coat with a missing button and a hat that had seen better decades. He reached out a trembling hand. Cooper met it halfway. The handshake was weak but deliberate. The man's eyes filled with tears as he whispered something in Dutch, a phrase Cooper didn't understand, but he didn't need to. Gratitude has its own language. "Yeah," Cooper murmured back, voice rough. "You're welcome." The man squeezed his hand tighter, then stepped back to his family. A woman, his wife maybe, held 2 children in her arms. One of them clutched a biscuit as if it were made of gold. "Hey, Coop," Miller called. "Command's on the radio. Supply trucks are on their way." Cooper nodded slowly. Of course they were. Now that the region had officially fallen, real aid would come. Organized, structured, efficient. Flour sacks, medical units, fuel. The army would do what armies do. But in his gut, he knew, this moment right now, the one with sticky hands and shared chocolate, would be what these people remembered. Not the trucks, not the logistics. This. Hours later, a larger column of Allied trucks rolled in. Medical teams set up triage stations at the church. Dutch doctors, those who had survived the winter, joined them almost immediately. Cooper watched from a distance as children were carried inside, wrapped in blankets, tiny hands clinging to whatever they'd been given earlier that morning. Crackers, candy wrappers, bits of warmth. A nurse brushed past him carrying a crate of condensed milk. Her face was focused, determined, the way people look when they've been waiting too long to finally help. Behind her, soldiers unloaded sacks of flour, boxes of vitamins, barrels of fuel. The town square became a blur of movement, like a heart that had finally started beating again after being still for too long. The locals, still weak, began to help where they could, guiding the elderly, lifting children, offering whispered words of thanks through tears and exhaustion. No parade, no speeches, just quiet, necessary work. The girl in the blue dress appeared again. She wasn't alone this time. 2 other children walked with her, their steps still unsteady but their eyes alive. She didn't approach Cooper right away. She hovered at a distance, watching him the way a bird watches someone holding out their hand. Then slowly she crossed the road. She held something in her palm, a tiny yellow flower, bruised and lopsided but still standing. Cooper crouched down so they were eye level again. She didn't say a word. She just held out the flower with both hands. It was the only thing she had to give. For a moment, Cooper couldn't speak. He felt the weight of months of war pressing on his shoulders, the faces of friends he'd lost, the cities burned, the endless marches through mud and cold. But here, in this quiet Dutch town, a starving little girl had handed him a flower. He took it gently. "Thank you," he whispered. She gave a small nod, almost solemn, then turned back to the other children. That night, as the convoy settled in, Cooper sat alone against the wall of a half-collapsed barn. The sky was clear for once. No artillery, no planes, just stars scattered across a black canvas. He twirled the little yellow flower between his fingers. It was already wilting, but he didn't care. Miller sat down beside him with a sigh. "You still thinking about her?" Cooper didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he finally said. "I guess I am." "Can't blame you," Miller muttered. "That was... hell, I don't even know what to call that." "Life," Cooper said quietly. Miller chuckled softly. "You sound like some kind of philosopher." Cooper smiled faintly, but his eyes stayed fixed on the flower. "We've been fighting for months," he said slowly. "And I thought victory would be flags, bands, parades. But today it was just a kid and a piece of chocolate." Miller was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Maybe that's the part that actually matters." They sat there together in the dark, listening to distant footsteps, the murmurs of medics, the occasional faint laugh of a child. Laughter. It still felt strange. But it was real. The war would end officially in just a few days. History books would talk about dates, treaties, and military campaigns. But Cooper knew that when people here remembered liberation, it wouldn't be the signatures on papers that stayed with them. It would be the moment a stranger knelt down and handed them a piece of food when they had nothing. It would be the chocolate, the rations, the flour. Decades later, the children of Wageningen would grow old. They would tell their own children about the hunger, the kind that eats everything inside you. But they would also remember that one morning when soldiers arrived, not with bombs, but with hope. And somewhere in those stories, there would be a nameless young sergeant with chocolate on his hands and a tiny yellow flower in his pocket. For Cooper, it wasn't about medals. It wasn't about being remembered. It was about the simple, terrifying, beautiful truth he'd felt standing in front of a starving little girl. War takes everything, but kindness, just a moment of it, can give life back.